Hello, hello. It's good to see you all. This is going to be a design commentary stream for Loot. I did one of these before, but it was with an older version of the game that, when I went back and looked at it, um, has a bunch of stuff that's not in the game anymore. So this is going to be a sort of updated, revised design commentary. It's based off of the quick start rules, which are they literally just got posted right before I started this stream. So I'm going to set the stage and kind of describe what Loot is, and then we're going to go through the quick start here, and I'm going to kind of give insight into how the game works and also why it was designed the way that it was. And then yeah, we'll kind of just take it from there. I'm doing this. I am streaming this, so if you're watching this live, feel free to ask questions and stuff like that. If you are watching this on YouTube after the fact, feel free to drop your questions in the comments and stuff like that. I'd be happy to answer any and all questions related to Loot that I can answer. So to sort of set the stage here, Loot is a fantasy role-playing game that I have been developing for a little while now, and we're getting closer and closer to making this thing a reality. All of this is very work in progress, which is why I have it opened up in my layout software. But we have some really fantastic art by Charlie Ferguson Avery. I think ideally, right away is just kind of showing us what this game is all about. This is a weird patchwork adventurer who's got all kinds of wild stuff on their person. Sword, big bag, scroll, grappling hook, arrows, half mask, weird bird, knife, all sorts of strange things. And that should immediately tell you this game is about loot. And that's the name of the game. I love, by the way, just slightly tangential, Affinity added the ability to put QR codes directly into your documents. Love that. So the quick start has links to the Kickstarter page and another video that I did that goes over Loot in like just about 3 minutes. This is going to be much longer than 3 minutes. Like I said, this is a fantasy RPG. It combines two things that I love in role-playing games, which is sort of a gameplay-based loop campaign, which is oftentimes seen in West Marches style campaigns, where you have like a home base that you're building up over time. Each session is a singular session where you're going to do a mission or a quest or something like that. And it allows for like drop-in, drop-out play. And then looter shooters, which are traditionally, video games, right? Video games or action RPGs like Diablo, Destiny, things like that, where you're just being rained down on loot and you're having so much fun chasing that loot. That's my goal here, but to do it with a fantasy game. Some things to note about Loot, or sort of to highlight it, it's a diceless RPG, so it uses Lumen 2.0, which means it's mostly about resource management outside of combat. Inside of combat, it's also diceless, and it's going to use a grid, kind of a quick, punchy tactical combat system. The loot system is sort of the beating heart of the entire thing, and like I said, there's that West Marches loop that I like. A thing that I'll say right away is that while I wrote the rules to this game and a lot of the foundational content to it, when this game eventually goes up on Kickstarter, which will be later this year, I will have selected a big group of guest writers to contribute to the game. Just like this character on the cover is a patchwork character made up of a whole bunch of different things, the game itself is going to be sort of a patchwork game where I'm going to be bringing on people to design factions for the game, loot for the game, monsters for the game, quests for the game, all sorts of things, so that there's lots of different weird interpretations about what's exciting about loot and monsters and fantasy games and all of that sort of stuff, all in this hodgepodge game. So I'm really excited to bring about that. Will Yobst is the one that got me the premise of the game in the first place in terms of a setting thing. I had no sense of a setting before. I wasn't really going to put anything setting-wise in the game, and what is in here is very loose. The basic premise, though, is that there's a big old kingdom ruled by a lich. That lich got taken out. People have decided to rebuild a city on top of the ruins of that lich's castle, essentially. It's tomb. And they need to rebuild. All these factions are showing up at the city, and they don't have money, but inside the vaults of this lich were like a ridiculous piles of loot. And so you are adventurers who have showed up at this city, and you're going to help them with various quests, and they will pay you with what they have on hand, loot. So this immediately sort of sets the stage for why the loot mechanic works the way that it does, because you do not get loot during a mission, like during a quest, or at the like end of a dungeon. You don't find a big pile of treasure. You get all of your loot back at the city when you go home. So I was trying to figure out why that is the case, and after talking with Will, this makes the most sense. The city is literally just paying you in loot because it's what they have on hand, because they took out a lich. I think that's really great. All right, so this is a Lumen 2.0 game, which if you've seen some of my other Lumen games, if you're familiar with Lumen, it's not about having big lists of skills. It's about having 3 approaches. So how you approach things and describe overcoming challenges is what's important, rather than having lists of skills like, negotiation, perception, animal handling, things like that. Because it's a diceless game, it's about resource management. So you have 3 different approaches here: force, flow, and focus. Force is your big, powerful, strength-based things, but also like highly emotional. Flow is quick, reactive sort of things, endurance. And focus is going to be slow, methodical, logical sort of actions. You'll describe things, and whenever you're describing how you overcome an obstacle or convince an NPC to do something, the GM will say, okay, it sounds like you're using this approach. You can spend a point of that approach, and when you do, the action happens. If you want to do the approach a different way than sort of what's called for, you can spend a different approach, but there's a consequence of some kind added. Or if you want to spend no points, or you've already spent all your points because it's a resource management game and you haven't managed your resources, big old problems come your way. These problems typically are going to result in difficulties that are going to show up in the next combat that you're in. This sort of list and pushing towards this came from, again, Will Yobst, who did a lot of game design consulting for this game. Just sort of like hammering out the difference between something that's just like a minor inconvenience and something that's way worse for you. That's pretty much how your adventurers are going to handle everything outside of combat. So they're going to get a quest, they're going to go out into the world, they're going to be delving dungeons, climbing wizard towers, doing whatever it is that they need to do. And as challenges are being put in front of them, they're spending these approaches to overcome them. And that will take you through most of the exploration. You'll eventually fight some things, and we'll talk about what combat looks like. But let's talk about who you are. You're these adventurers. And I really do think the best way to think about your characters is to think about them as paper dolls. That your characters are entirely defined by the loot that they carry. There is nothing about your character that comes from anything other than your loot. There's no classes, there's no backgrounds, there's no roles or anything like that. You are all a blank slate that gets filled in by the loot. I'm actually going to skip to the end here and just show you the character sheet, just so you can kind of see what I mean by that. So here's a character sheet. That's 2 of them on one page. As you can see, your character has spots for little loot cards. So you've got some weapons, you can hold 2 weapons, you can hold 3 magic items, you can hold some piece of clothing of some kind, you got a bag for consumables, and then a place for notes. Here's your approaches that I mentioned before. Notice that they are filled in or dashed. That's going to imply that you're going to have different values in these compared to your other fellow adventurers. Same thing with your health and armor. They have starting values, and then you're going to change them with the loot that you are wearing. So that's what your character sheet looks like. And so, yeah, like I said, you have clothing, 1 piece of clothing. And then I already see that I have to update the quick start because it says 2 here and you only have 1. So incoming itch update after this stream. You've got slots for your weapons, magic items, and you'll see examples of what all these things look like. Magic items can be things that are useful in combat, but they can also just be like narratively interesting things. Like, as long as you have at least 1 point of flow, you can walk on walls. That's a magic item that you have in the game. You have a bag that holds onto your consumables, health potions, and things like that, and then that's your character. Characters start with not a whole lot: 2 health, an armor, and then 1 in each approach. And then they're going to choose some starting gear. So let's go look at that starting gear just to give you a sense. These are the starting pieces of loot that the game starts with. So sword and board, dagger, magic missile, another spell, all sorts of stuff. A piece of clothing. You can see that this sort of goes up for 4 players, and 1 magic item for each person. And just to sort of set the stage here, like look at sort of what you get when you put these things on. When you put on something like the iron plate, it adds 3 to your character's health and 1 to your armor. So whoever decides to put this on is probably a beefier person. They're going to kind of take the front line when it comes to fighting and stuff. So they will update their character sheet to show that they actually have 3 more maximum health than other people and 1 more maximum armor than others. The cloak gives you some more health and armor, but it doesn't give you quite as much health, but it does give you a point of flow. That's going to help you outside of combat in other places like that. You can also see that like magic items can give you bonuses in those, or they can be used to give you cool powers. We'll go into sort of like more specifically how these things work later on. But that's what your characters are all about, is they're going to be this paper doll that gets updated as you get more loot, as you move through the game. To sort of explain like why I wanted to do that, I've spent a lot of my design career, so to speak, making games that are full of classes, that there are these distinct classes that are, this is your role, and these are the small suite of powers that you are very good at. And, that can be really fun, but there's also, I think, a lot of fun in having the ability to, like, swap that stuff out. I'm the sort of person that I have 10 different Elden Ring saves on my computer, because I'll start with sort of a build in mind, and then after a few hours, I'll be like, I really wish I was this instead. And with a lot of games, role-playing games, video games, things like that, it's not easy to change. If it's like class-based like that, if you've already kind of built a lot of your character towards one thing, it's not so easy to change to another thing. I want it to be super easy. I want somebody to be able to be like a tanky fighter one quest, and then they get some new loot and they suddenly get some like sneaky dagger stuff or like some spell stuff, and they go, actually, maybe this next time we get together and play loot, I'm gonna equip some more magic-y stuff. I'm gonna try and be more of a battle mage or just a straight up wizard and see how that feels. And there's not some like big overhaul of their character that they have to do. They don't have to relearn a bunch of advancement rules for their class or anything like that. It's just a matter of swapping out the gear that you have. So by having this sort of paper doll approach, you get this supreme level of flexibility with your characters that I think is pretty cool. The game is you're gonna have fights in it. This is a slightly more tactical, skirmishy sort of game than some of my others, which are typically in that like theater of the mind space. This game, like I said, it takes place on a grid. It's more tactical. It's a 6x6 grid, so it's not massive by any means. Rounds and turns. So there's a round. Everybody gets to take a turn. Once a PC takes a turn, then an enemy gets to take a turn, and they'll just go back and forth like that. On their turn, what can characters do? They can move, they can use any of their loot, they can drink a consumable or can use one, recover, or sort of a catch-all, which is maneuvering. I continue my agenda of trying to get people to use the word orthogonal. Orthogonal just means up, down, left, and right. It means not diagonal. So all range and movement is done orthogonally, rather than using diagonal as one space. If you're going to use diagonal as one space, I think you should just use a hex grid. So any game that uses diagonal as one space away, I think they should just change to a hex grid sort of format, because that would give you better sort of what you're looking for. Using a grid intentionally allows you to make diagonal 2 spaces away, which adds distance and scale to your grid without needing a massive board, right? I don't need a massive 20 by 20 grid, because a 6 by 6 is actually quite substantially far away if you're considering diagonals to be 2 spaces away rather than 1. So that's my rationale for doing orthogonal movement. Primarily, the characters are going to be using their loot. So here's an example of this. All loot, at least a lot of the weapons, are going to have 2 basic forms to them. They have a basic form and a charged form. Basic is just what the weapon is very good at. A simple sword is very good at hurting people. Not a lot, but a little. Range 1 tells us it's 1 space away on the grid, up, down, left, or right, not diagonal. And it deals 1 harm. So you can reliably just say, I swing my sword at this enemy, and it happens. Remember, it's diceless, so we're not rolling to see if you hit with the sword. These weapons also have the ability to be used, many of them have the ability to be used more powerfully. They have a charged effect. The charged effect gives you a bigger boost, so range 1, but it deals 2 harm. Not like substantially bigger for the sword, but that's because this is a beginner sword. It's a beginner item. It's not meant to blow your mind. Whenever you use an item's charged effect, you tap it. Again, I'm not sure if I could use the word tap. That's like a Magic the Gathering thing. The item is considered drained. You've used it. You can still use the basic form of it, but you can't use the charged form until you've taken time to recover and sort of reset your gear. So that's the resource management of combat. Is, yes, there's the resource of like your health, but really it's about thinking, when am I going to activate the charged abilities of the magic items and weapons that I have, and when will I have time to sort of recover and get those things back as I'm fighting off all of these different enemies. Let's look at some of the other like weapons, just to give you a sense of what this is like. So here's an example of something that doesn't have a basic action. So a shield doesn't have a basic action. It's not going to do anything, but you can stun somebody by bashing them with your shield. Here's the example of like the Shiv. It doesn't get increased range or harm, but it adds a status effect. It bleeds out people. And then some things are just purely charged only, like that shield. So these are some magic items. This Time Orb lets you actually reset a lot of your drained loot and your allies to do that. Or the Lure, which can be used to bring people towards you in a straight line. This can be helpful if you've laid down a trap or if you're trying to get them away from one of your allies. So you're just kind of like, with your character sheet, tapping and untapping these cards as you're deciding when is the time to use this equipment and when should I be, just kind of relying on the basic abilities of my stuff. You got consumables, nothing too mind-blowing there. It's going to be things like health potions or adding armor or things like that. Cooler consumables will be added to the game, primarily from the factions, which we'll talk about when we get to that part of the game. But like the factions are the people that have the unique stuff, and so their consumables will be kind of more in line with them. Max is here. Max has a question. Hey, Spencer, question about the loot. Is some loot going to be more powerful than others, or is it supposed to be roughly equal? Some loot is absolutely supposed to be more powerful than others. It's okay for there to feel like, oh yeah, I found the more powerful sword or the better armor or things like that. I think the goal is to create, if a piece of loot isn't as powerful as another, that's okay. Some loot is just not going to be as good. And if players decide that they don't want to hold on to some like worse loot, they can actually trade it in for money at the town and use that to improve the town. So it's okay if they end up getting junk loot, so to speak, because they can still benefit from it. But then also, there are opportunities to like take the loot that maybe has like less stats on it. Like, yeah, this armor isn't going to give you as much health as that really powerful plate armor, but it has some sort of weird, unique power that it gives you. And then you suddenly have like situationally good loot versus like kind of consistently always good loot. So yeah, there's sort of a variety in terms of the power scaling of the loot, and I think that's totally fine. And it's okay if there's some bad, I don't want to say bad loot, but just like worse loot than others, because like I said, it can all be traded in. You can recover during combat. When you do so, you get to untap. Again, I don't know if I can say that phrase. I'll have to update that. You can untap all your drained loot and heal 1 harm. This is also how you pick up a PC that is dying. So this is one of your actions. You only get 2 actions during your turn. So using one of these to recover all your things is really powerful, but it's using up half of your turn. So that's also part of the game, is thinking like, when is the time to recover? Am I far enough away from enemies that I won't get retribution for, catching my breath? This is also hopefully showing you that like, this isn't like my straight up power fantasy levels of stuff that you see in some of my other Lumen games, but the PCs are obviously pretty powerful here. I want them to feel cool and to like use their loot in fun ways, rather than feeling like their backs are against the wall the whole time. More and more, I've been putting something like maneuver into all of my combat rules. It's basically just like the catch-all. Like, hey, if somehow you want to do something and it's not using your loot or consumables or recovering or something like that, you can maneuver. It pretty much just means you want to use one of your approaches, and you should just have a conversation with your GM about what you're trying to accomplish and whether or not that's possible by spending an approach. And if you have that conversation, cool, it happens. I have this in here because I think it's okay to just say, if you want to try and do something else, have a conversation about it. Instead of, let me try and anticipate all the edge cases that people might have and produce rules for all of them, right? What are all the different things that somebody could do? Well, what about like grappling? People like to grapple in combat. Should I make a grapple action? No, that sounds super fucking annoying to do that. I would hate to do that. So instead, what I'll do is I'll just say maneuver. And if you want to go scale that wall, hide in a shadow, grapple somebody, table somebody, whatever it is that you want to do, have the conversation at the table. And if it seems like you could do it, do the approach, and then you're all set. Enemies are going to act between each of the PCs. Enemies don't carry loot, so they don't have cards that the GM has to sort of be manipulating and tapping and untapping. They just have abilities. Their abilities are going to look very similar to the basic and charge stuff that you see on PC loot, but it's just not formatted that way because the GM's got enough on their mind with all the other things that they're running that they don't need to like manipulate cards. So they're just moving enemies and activating them. Health and harm, there's nothing kind of new or mind-blowing here. There's health. When your health reaches 0, you're dying. Somebody's got to bring you back, otherwise you're dead. Enemies that go to 0 health, they're dead. Armor is a little bit different here than maybe it's used in other games. It is damage mitigation, but how it works is you don't have to opt in to use your armor. It's up to you whether or not you're going to use it. If you do, you take your current armor score and subtract that away from the incoming harm, and then reduce your armor score by 1. This shows that the armor is being worn away, rather than just somehow providing like an ongoing defensive bonus that is never reduced as you just get the shit kicked out of you. Like, your armor should be weakening over time. So that's what this represents, is that, I decided to use my armor to kind of take that big hit coming my way, but my armor is weakened by it. Like I said, you also get to choose if you're going to do that. So if I've got an armor score of 3 and I've got a goblin that's like stabbing me for 1 harm, I might not like use the armor to negate that. I might just take the health harm, because I might want to save that bigger armor score for when the bigger enemy hits me with that 2 or 3 harm hit. Then I can like shrug off that whole thing, and I feel like I'm more effectively using my armor. All of this, again, is going back into the realm of making combat about clever resource management of things like your armor and the tapping of the weapons and stuff like that, rather than success and failure being dictated by the roll of dice. So, I mean, all of that is relatively, I'll say, straightforward. I don't think there's anything in what we just kind of covered that is super mind-blowing or altogether like very different than other games that we've seen in the space or games that I've already made. The thing that I'm really kind of excited about with loot is the loot system. I've had this system in my head for a very long time, and I couldn't figure out which game to use it for. It was originally designed to be used for Light, my Destiny love letter, and I didn't end up making it for Light, and so it finally made its way here. And I've always imagined actually having like a loot pool that you are filling up and chasing pieces of loot in, like, strategically. To use Destiny as an example, in Destiny or Borderlands or games like that, you know that certain enemies have like certain drops, that if you go run this mission or fight this boss or whatever, there's a certain odds they're going to drop that particular piece of loot. And I thought, okay, well, how could we do something like that? How could we do this thing where people can kind of like grind out for loot in a way, understanding that a role-playing game is not as like quickly replayable as something like a video game. And this is where it ended up with the loot system. So you've seen the loot before. I've showed you pieces of it. There are these little square cards that you'll be able to print out. There's weapons, clothing, magic items, and consumables. Loot is divided up into sort of loot collections. So there's the city and all the loot that they found in the Lich's Tower. That's your biggest loot collection. That's going to be most of the sheets of loot that you have in your game. And then the factions have their own specific loot. Now, in this quick start version, that if you're looking at that, you'll notice that none of the factions have been included in this. In fact, most of the city mechanics for the game haven't been included, just to keep the quick start simplified. But just to kind of briefly talk about it, these factions are going to vary in theme, and each faction has their own collection of loot that is fitting to that theme. Let's use some pretty like obvious examples. A thieves guild is going to have a bunch of items that are like poison daggers and lockpicks and sneaky cloaks and things like that. A mages guild is going to have a lot of spells, right, and robes and things like that. And whoever you are working for, be it the city or one of these factions, they're the people that are feeding loot cards into your pool, which is going to be a deck of cards that has all the loot that you've ever possibly earned. And so you can be very intentional about how you fill that pool, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But it's all based off of these collections. So like I said, the loot pool is this deck. It's going to be kind of small at the beginning. There's just a starter deck that has some pieces of gear, and then everything that wasn't selected during character creation all gets shuffled together. That's your starting loot pool. Every time you do a mission, you are going to add cards to that pool. You're going to add them, one for each character, essentially. And let's say we decided to work for the Mages Guild. And there's 3 of us play. 3 pieces of Mages Guild loot get added and shuffled into that deck. And let's say we work for them again. 3 more Mages Guild things have been added. The pool is starting to get tilted in favor of being pretty mage-centric. Maybe that's because we as a party have decided we just want a bunch of spells. It means at the end of every quest, when we get our loot, we are more likely to get stuff that's themed towards the thing that we want, but it's still random. It's still sort of that loot chase that I love in looter shooters. It's not like, all right, we do this and we know we're guaranteed to get the fireball spell from the Mages Guild. You might end up getting gear that has nothing to do with the mages. And that's just because that's how the pool dealt out. And I really like that. I think that kind of the idea of randomized loot already exists in games, right? There's so many games out there that have you rolling on tables to see what you get. I like the idea of having this organic, this like dynamic deck of cards that you are shaping the contents of based off of who you are working for and filling it with the types of cards that you are seeking out. At the end of any quest, after those cards get added, gets shuffled up, and the GM just deals out a number of cards equal to the players. They don't give them to specific players, so it doesn't say like, give each player one card. It's, here's the 3 cards that you all earned. As a party, discuss what you want to do with that. Who wants to take what? And if you decide to take something, you might equip it to your character right away. And so now you're going to go back to your character sheet and change things. You're going to update your paper doll accordingly. Or you might hold on to it. You might be like, I'm going to vault this for now so that I can use it in the future. And then, of course, you could also just ditch it entirely. You might say, I actually don't want this. I'm going to sell it for gold. And gold is a generic currency that is used to buy new services in town. Now, again, the quick start, which is what you might be reading during or after this stream or video, doesn't have the services in it. But the services are these party-wide advancement mechanics. They are things that you can use to increase the approaches of all your characters or earn bonus loot by doing certain actions and things like that. This is the building up of the city. This is the West Marches side of it. In addition, you can also spend gold to lure more factions to move into the city. You know, I'm really excited to be working with contributing writers who are going to write factions because they can write just weird, bizarre factions, and those might be the ones that you try to tempt in. An example that I've used a lot on stream when talking about loot is like, what if there was like a mushroom dryad or like druids, mushroom druid cult. And so they've got a bunch of gear that are all weird and fungal and druidic and things like that. And we're like, yeah, we want them. We want access to their loot collection. So let's save up some gold. Let's sell some loot we don't want, get that gold and bring them to town. So that's the West Marches side of it, is you're building up the town through the services. You're luring in these new factions. And in luring in those new factions, you are inviting them to bring their loot collections for you to have more loot to go chase, to collect and sell for gold and buy more services and get more factions. And just, it's a looter shooter, right? That's exactly the goal, is for this to feel like a looter shooter, but in a fantasy setting. The one other thing that I realized is, you know, originally the loot pool had consumables in it, like healing potions and stuff like that. And I realized that felt really bad at the end of a quest to like deal out the loot, and like one of the things is a consumable as opposed to like a new piece of armor or weapon or magic item. So what I did is I took all the consumables, stripped them out of the main loot deck, and there's just a separate pool, the consumable pool. And this is the thing that you actually can pull from during the mission. So like when you're out on an adventure during a quest, the GM might reward you for searching for things or cool roleplay or stuff like that by pulling from the loot pool or the consumable pool, and now you've got these things that you can spend. And they all just get shuffled right back into the consumable pool at the, you know, between missions. I like doing this because it doesn't dilute the loot pool itself by putting a bunch of this stuff in here, and it solves the problem of like, okay, but how do we reward the players for exploring scenes and like searching through a cabinet and finding something? Well, they can find a consumable, and the consumables can be just as random as the loot pool, and that's the stuff that you find, and that's fun. The one other thing about the consumables is that there's, again, like a generic set of starting stuff, starting consumables, but every time you unlock a faction, all of their consumables get added to this pool. So again, if we unlock a Thieves Guild faction, then this consumable pool probably just got a bunch of like lockpicks and poison vials and things like that added to it. And so now the world is just a little bit more influenced by this faction. And so as we bring in more factions, the consumable pool is just going to get filled with all sorts of real wacky stuff. And that's it for the rules. That covers the quick start rules and everything that you've seen. In terms of what you can do with the game right now, you can build some characters with the starting loot and go just do some combat just to see what it feels like. I've included some prompts that you can follow for quests, or a slightly structured quest that you can use to explore the game. It's not super detailed because I don't like writing quests. That's why I'm hiring people to do it. And just because it's meant very much to be your introduction to the game, so it's very loose. And then the rest of the document is just the loot itself. And so I kind of want to just like stop on a couple of these just to show you, like, here's the consumables. So things that let you recover armor or health or things like that, but also like stunning enemies. You can throw a smoke bomb down, or the Silken Tonic. You can temporarily get the ability to climb walls and ceilings. So this would be something that you could drink outside of combat and just be like, yeah, I can climb on the wall now. That's kind of fun. Here's more stuff. I was clearly reading Saga when I was writing some of this loot from before. So there's Lion Cat. I'll probably change the name of that one eventually, but you know, the magic items in particular, they can just be these passive things like, I just need some more health, so I'm gonna wear the Amulet of Body. But they can also be weird things like Lion Cat or Silken Scarf, where as long as you have a certain amount of an approach, you get some narrative benefit. You can always detect when someone is lying to you. Is that as helpful as this? I don't know. It could be. Depends on how you play the game, right? Someone might want that because they're the tank. They need to survive in combat. But if you're like more of the silver tongue sort of person in the group, then you might be like, yeah, I'm actually going to use up one of my magic item slots to be able to tell when people are lying. Or if you're like a roguish thief, you might give up one of your magic item spots to be like, yeah, I need to be able to walk on walls. That's important for me. Here's more examples of, like I said, there's just lots of magic items and clothing and weapons in the game, but this is just a small selection of the starting stuff. Whatever you see in the quick start is certainly by no means the full loot collection. I have a lot more that I've written and that I'm bringing on writers to write tons and tons more. I provide a grid for you to be able to play some example enemies, and then like I said, there's lots more to come for this game. You know, lots more loot, the factions themselves, the services, which are not here in this quick start but are a really kind of cool element of the West Marches side of the game, enemies to fight, quests, all of that sort of stuff. You know, as I'm recording this, the Kickstarter page to like follow the campaign is now up. It's on the Loot itch page, and you can find it linked in the quick start. But yeah, that's the design commentary for the Loot quick start. I'm really excited about this. I hope you're excited about it too. We are actually one day away from me closing the application process for taking on new writers. So in the coming weeks, I'll be reading the people who applied and kind of putting together the teams. So I'll be making announcements about the teams in the few weeks. And then, yeah, the game will be crowdfunded sometime later this year. I don't know an exact date, so I apologize for just being sort of nebulous and cagey about that, but it'll come later this year. So I hope you enjoyed learning about the Loot quick start and this design commentary. I hope you have a better understanding about why the game works the way that it does. And yeah, that's it. Thanks. Bye.